attempt to capture all of the points, might have left out some things, might have even misspelled some of the organizations or whatever happened. Apologies for that. So let's look at the regional. If we look at the regional human rights mechanisms, at the top we have the fora that happen on minority rights issues on the regional level. That is also, Corinne has a strong connection to the Tom Lantos Institute, which is kind of organizing these events, and we've been participating in them in part already. I just remember that Veseleni Veseleni and your colleague Jefferson attended the forum in Latin America, but also Abu Bakrin attended the one in Africa. But expand on that, make that sustained engagement. There are also other regional fora that I mentioned there. It mentions African and Middle Eastern regional forum that will be hosted. And then there was also this point that was raised about the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And I think that was the contact that was mentioned from our friend Julian. And that's also something we need to take on and strategize about how exactly we can approach them in the most effective way. The Africa group had already, from the Planet Dakar, that they elaborated there and talked about the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and that I think is also the ambition is quite clear there to obtain an accreditation as an organization to officially also take the floor and to contribute there systematically in that regional forum. And there's another point that we have mentioned here is that the Ambedkar International Mission through the diaspora had thought about attaining ECOSOC accreditation that we also wanted to note down. Then the SDG Regional Fora is the next heading that is also quite, I think, quite clear. The fora happen as part of the, let's say, HLPF cycle. So from March or from January to sometimes even May, there's the European, South American or American and the Caribbean, Asian, African and European forum. There where we can organize side events, also develop other, let's say, engagement tools, and then elaborate on them. And you can see that, all of these points are kind of reflected in the 3 and 5 years too, that we kind of start the engagement in the beginning only, like with a speaker or having a side event. And in the end, in year 5, we want to have a sustained engagement with those, meaning that we organize a main session of the main event or have a speaker at the main event to kind of solidify our engagement and our presence in these regional fora. The last point on year 1 is the EU parliamentarians, to engage them to monitor. There was one point that came up from the European and Latin American group yesterday, where we have an engagement with, let's say, parliamentarians who have as part of their portfolio countries within our network, meaning members of the European Parliament, when they come for a country visit to Mali, to Brazil, the European friends know them, know when they also will come, and connect, let's say, the European dimension with the regional or with the local or the national dimension that is at play. And that creates a new kind of advocacy pressure and tool that we've not been using before, and which seems to be very promising and powerful, according to our friends at Ergo and also to Mina, who have a lot of experience in this kind of lobby work. And then the last point on this is a sub-point, which is also how can we use other state actors and modern governments to include the same kind of advocacy tools that we envision for the European parliamentarians. So there was mentioning of the US and the US State Department or other organisms that we might want to involve or can involve to kind of put pressure on them when they come for a country visit. And I think we don't need to talk too much about year 3 and 5. It's just basically an amplification of our activities and solidifying our ambition to become at the regional events kind of key actors that have a speaking role, if not an organizing role, as part of the official program, and have an official session or official speakers in those regional bodies. Now we have the global. There at the very top is towards the UN declaration, and then in brackets the resolution, since that needs to come first, on the rights of communities discriminated on work and dissent. Under the first heading we have to create a draft resolution, and that I think has already happened in part from our event on Monday, where we have already taken notes and have some kind of demands that were raised there in a format that we will share with you after the conference, also for inputs. But we can also develop that further. That was based on the document that was published last year, on like a draft charter or draft of demands that we created even last year. But anyway, this process is simply going on. Then, to engage with other, let's say, mechanisms, such as the UN Network of Racial Discrimination Protection of Minorities, and also approach the Human Rights Advocacy Committee to establish a formal working relationship towards a resolution. The next point is mapping. There was a lot to talk about. We need to know who is in the country to achieve effective advocacy. And this point is that. There was talk about an interactive dashboard of a mapping tool to really have clear who is in which countries, and to know more, to use this as evidence and as materials for us to do effective advocacy. That I think is key to do, and is covered under this point. And not only the mapping, but also attempting to specify the different specific areas like water and sanitation that we have already kind of worked on in the past, but also maybe new aspects, but also, for example, we talked about, and with Shannon being here, the whole issue of climate justice is also coming there. So how can we kind of divide our work stream in thematic areas that are also really relevant for different groups that we can engage in. Then we also need to have a consistent and systematic contributions to special rapporteurs, what they have written already in the past, special rapporteurs, and existing materials, to collate them, to kind of create a database that is comprehensive, and from that also produce a material that is like 1 or 2 pages that we can give to people, for example in missions, to use as advocacy materials. Then there is the formation of working groups that was mentioned also. There were many kind of ideas, also desires to have different working groups, and they're listed here. I'll just go through them briefly. So the UPR working group, then on gender and intersectional issues, on the UN Declaration, on media and communications, on diaspora and youth engagement, and on advocacy. Again, these are for your comments, amendments, and consideration. Then it was also mentioned that we should reach out and build new alliances, and when we say reach out and have alliances, sometimes just to think more of like, what can we do with them in terms of events, in terms of advocacy opportunities. So just a list of different actors that we might want to engage in. On the NGO level, the corporate level was also mentioned. It was mentioned that the least, let's say, problematic actors we might want to approach. There's civil society in general. There is the major group of other stakeholders where we want to also sustain and expand our engagement in. There's also the general media that we want to engage more with our issues. And a UN NGO committee in New York. That is, I think, almost the same actually as the MGOS. Maybe one point for me to just cross out. Yeah. Great. Then permanent missions is the next point. Also came out very clearly from the discussions, and also supported by the visit we had to the mission of Costa Rica. That is key to find our allies, to really obtain votes, because those are the votes in the UN in the end, is the member countries, member states. Okay, yeah. Yeah, there's some more details, but let's not go into them. I think it's pretty clear and also straightforward. We also mentioned EU missions to the UN, and we mentioned in the text itself some of the key countries that we had identified, or we want to identify, but this needs to also be expanded clearly to more. Then, general UN, SDG and HLPF. There are several interventions that we can make. We always have the speaker that we can nominate. We can provide a textual input that is considered an official HLPF document and is taken also on the UN website. So we basically sustain all of that activity and expand it and become better at it. As an ambition for the coming years, and also make it more strategic to align it with our other priorities and our other work in the other human rights treaty bodies and other, let's say, mechanisms. Then, at the end of, at the last point, you can see that we want to create an informal working group of member states. This informal working group is not so far away, since we already have many friendly countries towards us, but we need to still, let's say, formalize the informal a little bit more to really achieve it and to get their input or get their buy-in. Then in year 3, and in year 5, as before, you have the ambitions and the objectives that we have tried to put down. So, in year 3, we want to have a UN resolution on the rights of CWD being adopted. That's a very clear aim, and for year 3. But also, the other points are just basically extensions of what we said before. We want to create new alliances, sustain those alliances, nourish those alliances, and draw out the best from those alliances for our advocacy work. And I think then we go already to treaty bodies, sustained and strategic engagement with the different committees that we had before. But now it's also on the global level, since we want to have a global strategy that incorporates all of them and makes it a little bit more strategic, and we have an overview and an approach that is coherent and coordinated amongst all the members. We have, as last point, under the year 3, the Human Rights Council, and basically establish a formal relationship with the Human Rights Advocacy Committee, and establish also a formal NGO committee that can participate in some of our activities. Then, as last point, year 5, the kind of long-term aims. You can see an international year on CWD was mentioned a couple of times, and I was assured that it's not that hard, but let's see. Then the permanent missions. We want to have a proper long-term relationship, trust, and in the end, by year 5, also a formal working group that follows the resolution in year 3 that we wanted to have, when we want to adopt or see adopted. And I think then we just mentioned the VNRs again, increased and sustained engagement in the HLPF, and basically expanding on the other points we have made. At the very bottom you see agencies that we want to really reach out and work with, and there are some of the, I think, long-term goals that we just try to articulate in that. And with that, I think I close here, and I'll open the floor to all of you to make your comments, amendments, and suggestions. And already, I think, give the microphone just to you, Manjula, if I may, to make your comments about India, and then we can try to incorporate this directly into the plan. Jared, you can just open the plan and then. Paul wants to speak. I'm not sure who should speak first. You decide.
Thank you. Thank you, Johannes. The way that I see, and also the flow that has come since day before yesterday, there are three key elements that are very important. One, I think that Ibrahima and others have brought, we need to establish the evidence in each of our countries and with our communities that the common minimum human rights charter principles are not being implemented or not being accessible to our communities. And this has to be through a gender lens, through the child rights lens, through the sexuality lens, and of course through principles of non-discrimination, principle of equality, and some of those. I think these we will have to establish in our country. I think some have it because of the fact that many of you have been working on it. Some of us may not have it. So if we can say in the first year, can we have 10 countries or 11 countries from the CDWD, because we need to run with a good substantive representation from each of the continents. Say from Africa, at least 3, if not 4. From Latin America, of course, Brazil, but can we get one more country? So 2 from Latin America, and at least 5 from South Asia, and at least, I do not know, Atanas and Carmen, maybe 3 or 4 from Europe, if we can have. And this can be either, in one of the suggestions that had come yesterday from our group is, can we have a very thoroughly worked SDG shadow report? Because then you look at hunger, you look at poverty, you look at gender, you look at education, you look at decent work, you look at land resources, climate justice, budget, rule of law and human rights. So almost a bunch of things are already there. And since from the CDWD perspective, we don't have this kind of a global or even specific country-wise, except maybe I think in Asia we've attempted for the last 3 or 4 years. But if we can have this as a base, and then that becomes the springboard for going beyond our narrative. I think that is the next one that we'll have to say. Till now, most of us have been involved, engaged in narratives of what we are experiencing. But that should only be 40% of the substance. The 60% is, how is it against the rule of law and equality and basic democratic principles established already in the country and also at the UN. And then the third important, so 40% narrative, 30% what are the violations if you benchmark it against the common democratic principles. The third one is, therefore, so what? So we demand 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We cannot have a policy or a note without these 3 elements: narrative, accountability mechanisms, and what does it reflect, and therefore what are our demands. So these three things we have to establish. And the third one, I think all of us have said, none of this UN is really effective if it doesn't go the pendulum way. So if you have a ground level report, it has to work its way up to the national parliament, national human rights mechanisms, the accountability structures, and then go up to regional and the UN level. We need to take that swing. If it is already a norm that we have established at the UN, then we need to swing it back to the community. So this swing is really essential. So the third element is, how are we going to take this up and how are we going to bring back the gains and the norms and standards that have been achieved back to the community. So this, I think, if we can establish in the first year in terms of the SDG shadow report, specifically focusing on as many indicators, goals as possible, and we should have a common, if we can have a common decision. Some of the things here that have come is education, adequate housing, water and sanitation, contemporary forms of slavery, violence against women, inequality, budget governance, human rights defense, and climate justice. Maybe we want to do more, but at least can we have this minimum 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 themes in all the countries from the CDWD and the gender perspective. If we can have this as a minimum document that we will commit to producing in 1 year. Of course, those who have done, probably they can think of other interventions. And the second one, I think, is making sure that the visibility is reached at the regional mechanisms. And we have several regional mechanisms depending on the strength. Unfortunately, the Asia has been the weakest. But Europe is very strong, Africa is very strong, Latin America, inter-American human rights mechanisms, institutions are very strong, or at least stronger than some of the others. So I think those need to be, and then of course the UN steps to get the, form an informal working group, have a draft. But of course, Brima was saying that not just draft by us, but slowly get a resolution, steps to get a resolution. So how do you work with the permanent missions? So we don't have, these are all not sequential in that sense. Some of the elements can be done in the first year itself, briefing them, taking them through the journey, and making sure that we have a spectrum, academics, experts, human rights defenders on the ground, leaders of the community, and the political representatives. I think all these 4 or 5 categories of people need to be taken along, so that we don't only limit ourselves to a small group of one type of category of these people.